Okay, good afternoon, everyone. The church bell has not yet rung, but it is just about 1 o'clock, and I want to make sure we get started. Hopefully you can hear me in the back. If you can't hear me, feel free to get a little bit closer, as close as you feel comfortable. But it is my great pleasure to welcome you back to our first in-person tour of Burial Hill since March of 2020. Yay! I agree, that deserves a round of applause. I know it's been a long 2 years. My name is Ann Mason. I am the Executive Director of the Plymouth Antiquarian Society, and this tour series is presented by the Antiquarian Society and Pilgrim Hall Museum. And our theme for today is travel. So we're going to be exploring stories of Plymoutheans on the move. And I have to admit, this tour topic was inspired perhaps by the months of the pandemic when we really couldn't travel. And I kept coming across different letters in the Antiquarian Society archives that just were about travel tales. People writing to their sister or to their husband about the journeys that they're on. And I thought, well, that would be sort of interesting to explore this topic of travel, to think about where people went and how they got there. And as we do so, we'll be able to talk about changes to the transportation system locally and across the nation, and how that really impacted the growth and development of the United States and even the growth and development of Plymouth itself. So we are going to start, our first stop is actually off the asphalt path. Now when we think about travel, this is of course a huge topic, because as long as human beings have been walking, they've been traveling places. And so fundamentally, the major form of transportation were your two legs. And if you were fortunate, you might end up with 4 legs if you had a horse, or if you had a draft animal who you could either ride or have pull a wagon or a carriage, and that would help you take some of the burden off your legs. But in addition to walking or riding over land, you also would take advantage of the waterways, of course, and it actually in many cases would be easier to travel by water than to travel across land. So we're not really going to talk about those early years here in Plymouth and colonial America, where those were the main methods of transportation. I want to jump ahead to the end of the 18th century, where we have a new transportation technology, or new transportation system, that's really going to make a huge difference into the 19th century. So we're here at the grave of Dr. James Thatcher. He's to my left. You can see there's an American flag next to his stone. He did serve with distinction in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. He was a surgeon. And we're not going to get into it, but if you would like to read a fascinating account of wartime travel, you should look for Dr. Thatcher's military journal during the Revolutionary War. So he kept a journal, and in 1823 he published it, and it describes everywhere he went, what he did during the war, and it really is interesting to read. He was also, Dr. Thatcher came back to Plymouth after the war. He established a practice here in Plymouth, and he was a prolific writer of medical texts and other books. So he actually is one of the wonderful sources for medical historians, because he documented how people in the 18th century were treating all sorts of different conditions, how they were performing surgery, and so wonderful research from that standpoint. He also wrote a history of the town of Plymouth in 1835. And not only in that book did he document Plymouth's history, he also offered some reflections on the town as it existed in the 1830s. So he brought you right up from the Pilgrims to 1830s and told you a little bit about Plymouth. And so he was very excited to document one new form of transportation, which was the stagecoach. So the stagecoach began operating regularly between Plymouth and Boston in 1796. And this is what Dr. Thatcher says: "We have now a stage establishment equal to any in the country, running daily in various directions and provided with excellent horses and careful and attentive drivers." Although we can boast of no railroad cars to facilitate conveyance, our public roads are kept in fine order, and our fathers would say that our stagecoaches are good enough for their posterity to travel the paths over which they themselves were satisfied to trudge on foot or to ride on the back of bulls. So I wonder if Dr. Thatcher is not being a little defensive, because of course in 1835 when he wrote that, the railroad was the newest technology for transportation and travel, and maybe he was feeling a little bit defensive that Plymouth did not yet have a railroad station. We'll get to that in a couple of stops. But he is certainly defending the stagecoach and reminding his readers of what a wonderful system it is to have roads that are maintained so that you can actually have horse-drawn carriages, coaches travel between different towns. And in fact, the stagecoach journey from Boston to Plymouth took 10 hours. So that was quite an improvement. If you think about if you rode a horse from Boston or from Plymouth to Boston, it would probably take a full day to get there. Obviously, it actually would have been faster to take a ship out of Plymouth Harbor and to go up to Boston Harbor. But for overland travel, 10 hours, that was considered a huge improvement. It was a huge improvement. And as Dr. Thatcher emphasizes, it's a lot better than going by foot. Now, I want to shift our gaze a little bit to this end of the Thatcher family plot. We have right here, Betsy Hayward Thatcher is buried here, and she was James Thatcher's daughter. She married Daniel Elliott of Waynesboro, Georgia in 1804. Now, Waynesboro is approximately 100 miles northwest of Savannah, Georgia. When they were married, Betsy and Daniel traveled down there. Daniel was a slave owner. He owned a plantation in Waynesboro, and the young couple settled there to live. Now, that was probably about a journey of 1,000 miles by ship to get from Plymouth down to Savannah and then across country to Waynesboro. They had two daughters. Jane was born in 1805 and Catherine was born in 1807. And then Daniel Elliott died in 1810 while Betsy was pregnant with their third child. And so Betsy has to repeat that journey of 1,000 miles from Georgia back to Plymouth. She brings with her her daughters Jane, age 5, and Catherine, age 3. She stays with her father, Dr. James Thatcher. Sadly, she does give birth to the third daughter, Susan, who died when she was 10 months in 1811. So Betsy suffers a lot of loss in a very short number of years. She remarries Michael Hodge, who was a lawyer from Newburyport in 1814, and then he died in 1816. So between 1810 and 1816, Betsy loses 2 husbands and 1 child. But she stays in Plymouth with her daughters Jane and Catherine, and she also had a son from her second marriage who was James Thatcher Hodge. So 3 children living here in Plymouth. Michael Hodge is buried next to Betsy, but again, you can hardly make out his stone. I don't really want to focus so much on Betsy and her travels. I really want to jump forward to her daughter Jane and to look at a journey that Jane took in 1825. She was well connected. She had a lot of family connections through her mother and her father, and they were comfortably situated. So she was not, working. She was able to take the time for leisure travel as the opportunity presented itself. Now, the details of her journey do not survive, so we don't actually know when she left Plymouth or who she traveled with at the beginning of her trip, but in July of 1825, she wrote a letter to her sister Catherine, and that letter survives in the Antiquarian Society's collection. And she was writing from Rocky Hill, New York, which today basically is in the Queens borough of New York City on Long Island. And she notes that she's about 3 miles from the city on the East River. She's staying with the Hall family. Again, we don't really know too much about who the Hall family, who were the members of the Hall family, how are they connected to the Thatchers and the Elliots. But she notes that Mrs. Hall came into the town, meaning New York City, came into town on Saturday and brought me to this place, which is a delightful retreat from the heat and dust of the city. Your fair sis is enjoying herself exceedingly, clambering over the rocks and listening to the crash of waves, or watching the passage of the boats in their way to and from the city. 13 steamboats, besides all the other varieties of vessels, from the ships to the little fishing boat, daily pass the windows, so near that you can easily discern and sometimes distinguish the people on board. So I just find that a fascinating account from young Jane Elliott here in, staying on the East River, obviously 3 miles from the heart of New York City, a very different environment than it would be today if we were to visit. But she's fascinated by all of this river transportation, especially these steamboats. And so her mind in her letter turns to her return home. She tells Catherine, "I think I shall be home at next week. I begin to be impatient to be once more quiet and settled and almost tired of roving. Mrs. Ballister's sister and her nephew, Mr. Lincoln of Canton, and his wife mean to return to Boston the last of this week or the first of the next, and I think I shall go with them, as they are very pleasant people, and being previously acquainted, it will be more agreeable in the boat than to be with strangers." So I find, again, it's fascinating to think of what a different world it was. Today, if we take a trip, we book our tickets, we generally know how we're getting home, who we're traveling with, when we're leaving. For Jane, she is not, certainly she's not able to independently travel, but she's depending on all these networks of family, friends, and relations to connect her from one destination to another. And she obviously prefers traveling with people she knows than perhaps traveling with people who are acquaintances of the family, but she doesn't really know them all that well. And now she turns in her letter to Catherine to talk about the method of traveling. She says, "There is no manner of traveling so free from fatigue, dust, and etc., and consequently so pleasant as the steamboats. You go on board, sit down quietly, and are homeward more rapidly than on the wings of the wind, without any of the disadvantages of a stage or carriage. You are not obliged to stop and rest the horses, nor are you annoyed by being squeezed up with everybody in a warm day." So I hope Dr. Thatcher didn't read this letter, because he might not appreciate his granddaughter suggesting that the stagecoach wasn't a magnificent way to travel. But it does draw our attention to the steamboat. Now, the first successful design for a steamboat was the Claremont, which was built by Robert Fulton and made its first voyage in 1807 up the Hudson River from New York City to Albany, New York. And it traveled at 5 miles per hour. But typically these steam-driven boats it was a steam-driven paddle wheel. So you would have a steam-powered engine that would turn the paddle wheel, and that's how the boat would move upriver. And it was really wonderful because you would get a lot of power from the steam so that the engine could actually carry the boat against the current. So steamboats could go up the river and down the river and make a round trip. They didn't, unlike sailing boats, you didn't have to worry about the currents or the wind. Now, there is a downside to a steamboat, and Jane's going to get to that. She says, "The boat which goes up the North River is free from the danger to which others are exposed from the bursting of the boiler. The boat, or rather floating hotel, which contains the passengers, is towed by a steam engine, which is fastened at some distance to it, so that should there be an explosion, it would be out of the reach of any danger. It has been in operation but a short time, and though it is not as rapid yet, I would rather be a little longer time for the sake of the feeling of perfect security, which you cannot quite feel in the other boats. And Jane is not exaggerating here. The steamboat was actually fairly dangerous because the boilers that were used to create the steam often exploded if they built up too much pressure, or when they built up too much pressure. If they build up too much pressure, they're going to explode. And moreover, steamboat boats would often hit obstacles. So you can imagine going down a river, it's pretty hard to turn them in response to a rock or a log or other debris. And so steamboats would sink fairly frequently. And on average, the lifespan of a steamboat was just 4 to 5 years before it exploded or sunk or had to be decommissioned. So what Jane seems to be describing is more of a barge that is pulled by a steam-powered tugboat, and this way the passengers are kept at a distance from the danger of that steam engine. Jane did get home safely. She married, just a few years later, in 1827, she married Charles Seaver. The same year, her sister Catherine, to whom she was writing, married Nathaniel Russell Jr., and then they both lived here in Plymouth. We can't quite see the Russell house, but it's on the corner of Russell Street and Court Street, and so generations of Catherine's descendants lived in that house. And then both Jane and Catherine are buried in Oak Grove Cemetery here in Plymouth. So we don't have their grave sites to visit, but we do have their mothers and their grandfathers. Okay, so now we're going to retreat up the hill, and we're actually going to stay on the asphalt paths from here on out, and we're just going to travel a short distance in that direction, sort of southwest, roughly. We are here at the Judson family plot. We have a missionary family here with a connection to Plymouth. They're memorialized on this, again, it's another marble stone, a tabletop stone. And the person I want to highlight, whose name is on this stone, is Anne Judson. Born in 1789, she was a daughter of a family in Bradford, Massachusetts. She actually was a teacher in Bradford as a young woman. And she sort of catapults to fame when she marries Adoniram Judson. The two were among the very first of America's foreign missionaries. And she has, so on the stone we actually have a number of people who are memorialized, including Anne and Adoniram, and his father was actually a pastor at the Third Congregational Church here, or the Third Church here in Plymouth, and for a time he himself taught in Plymouth. So that's their Plymouth connection, and you actually have the gravesite here of Abigail Judson, who was Adoniram Judson, the missionary's mother. So Anne never actually lived here in Plymouth, as far as we know, but she had family who did. She was Adoniram Judson's first wife, and when she was teaching in Bradford, Massachusetts, it was when the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions was formed. It's an interesting period in American history because we have just become a new nation. We're trying to figure out what it means to be an American. It's also this period after the Second Great Awakening when there's a lot of religious revival. And so a lot of Christian churches are thinking about missions, as something that they want to start doing. So some European countries were already sending missionaries out, and the Americans want to make sure that they're also doing this. So it's partly, it's this intersection of sort of that American national identity going out overseas, having a place in the world, as well as this desire to reach peoples who had never heard the Christian gospel. So Adoniram and Anne are married on February 5th, 1812, while the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions is figuring out, how are they going to support missionaries, who they're going to send. They prefer to send young men who are already married because there's a chance that you're never coming back. And it's felt that having a wife while you're overseas is important, for a number of reasons. So Adoniram picks Anne. He marries her February 5th, and on February 19th, they sail for Calcutta, India. Anne is at this point 23 years old. So again, she's still very young. She hasn't known her husband that long. They've only been married for, really 2 weeks. And they're going off to sail across the world to form a missions outpost in India. It was a 4-month voyage. And while they're on the seas, they actually are in conversation and they adopt Baptist principles. So they were commissioned by, the New England Congregational churches. They decide that, no, we think we're Baptists, and so they then have to resign. So if you can imagine, they're now, on this voyage to India, but they don't actually have any official support. There's no one back in the United States who's supporting them as missionaries because they've jumped ship. So they do make it to India. They're forced to leave India. They end up in Burma, which is now Myanmar. And they actually established there the first mission of American Baptists. And so they're often very widely celebrated by American Baptists today. What were they doing? Well, they were evangelizing. Anne was educating children. She was caring for orphans. And they were both working on Bible translation. Now, in 1824, war broke out between the British and the Burmese. So this is in the period when the British Empire is expanding, and they're hitting a lot of resistance from people who, already live in these areas. And so you have this war that breaks out. Adoniram is imprisoned with many of the other foreigners. They're seen as a threat to the Burmese. Doesn't matter that he's American. He could be spying for the British. So Anne is not imprisoned, and she spends just about the next 2 years while he is in prison lobbying government officials, bringing him food, trying to figure out a way to get him released. And he ultimately is released in February of 1826. And Anne dies of smallpox in October of 1826. So it's like a soap opera, yes. I mean, it is. Like, that was how, in some ways, this was how it was received. Not in a soap opera for a lot of the reasons that the soap operas today might be popular. But there is this idea that you have these particularly young women like Anne, and I should mention that Adoniram married 2 more women. So Anne died, and then he married a second time, Sarah Hall Boardman. She died. He married a 3rd time to Emily Chubbuck. So there are a lot of young women who are married to these young men going out to be missionaries, and it's a very dangerous life. There's disease like smallpox. There's the threat of war. There's, the hazards of crossing the ocean and traveling in these foreign lands. But at the same time, these are tales of sacrifice, of courage, of personal conviction and faith that carries men and women to go all this way across the world to do this work. And so after Anne's death, the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions wanted to publish a biography. And really the idea behind the biography was we can celebrate Anne Judson, and we can also celebrate the work of missions and hopefully gain support for what we're trying to do. So James Knowles, who was pastor of the Second Baptist Church in Boston, began compiling letters and journals, some of which Adoniram saved in Burma and brought back to the United States, some of which he just collected from Anne's family and friends in the United States itself. And he published them as the memoir of Mrs. Anne H. Judson, late missionary to Burma, in 1829. So he actually, in the introduction to the book, he explains, well, it's taken me quite a few years to do this because, I had to go out and gather all these documents. But the benefit is that really you're hearing Anne's story through her own words. So he actually does include large excerpts from her letters and her journals in this memoir. And I want to share one example with you. This is from a letter that Anne wrote to her mother, March 1st, 1812. No daughter would ever more gladly relieve the anxieties of a mother than I yours. The motives which have induced me to go, and you to give your consent, ought now to support us and prevent our indulging useless regret for what we cannot help. The life I now lead is much happier than I expected. Though deprived of many sources of enjoyment, I am surrounded with mercies. I have been sick every day since we sailed until today. My sickness has not been very distressing. I have been quite well part of the time, and when my sickness returned, found almost immediate relief from lying down. I suffer the most for the want of an appetite. However, we have such a variety of provisions on board, I generally find something I can relish. From the order and regularity of things in the cabin, you would hardly imagine we were on board a vessel. The captain is a young gentleman of an amiable disposition and pleasing manners. He and all the officers treat us with the greatest kindness and respect. Everything they have is at our service. Last Sabbath, the first of our being here, we had no preaching or religious worship. Today it was proposed to the captain to have worship in the cabin. He readily assented and joined with us, together with 2 of the other officers. I have not heard the least profane language since I have been on board the vessel. This is very uncommon. So I think you can get a sense from that letter just of all the mix of emotions that Anne is feeling. Again, this young woman in her 20s, she's separated from everyone she's known. She's separated, she's with her husband who she really doesn't know at all, traveling across the ocean with expectations that she will never potentially return home again. And Anne's memoir was very popular. Like the other missionary tales, again, they're very compelling. They're inspirational in some ways, and they also have all these episodes of danger.
Anne Judson's story continued to be told decades after her death. The Knowles memoir was very popular and was republished in multiple editions. Gaudet's Ladies' Book, one of the most popular women's magazines of the 19th century, highlighted Anne in an article titled The Heroism of the Knights Errant and the Female Missionaries of America in 1848. Sarah Josepha Hale, the editor of Gaudet's Ladies' Book, included Anne in her book Woman's Record, Sketches of All Distinguished Women, which went through multiple editions in the 1850s. And in 1895, almost 70 years after Anne's death, she appeared in John Telford's Women in the Mission Field, Glimpses of Christian Women Among the Heathen.
So I think most everyone is gathered here. And we are here at one of the, another family plot. These are Spooner family graves. Now, the person that I actually want to talk about is not, well, as far as we know, she's not buried here. We don't know where she is buried. That's Mary Elizabeth Spooner. But her brother, one of her brothers, is buried here, Nathaniel Spooner, or is memorialized here. He died at sea, but he's memorialized here. His wife is memorialized here, as well as some of the members of that branch of the family. And then here in the middle is James Spooner, who was Mary Spooner's grandson. And we're actually going to get to him in a little bit too. So we're going to talk about Mary first, and then we'll talk about James. Now, Mary Spooner was born in 1804, so that actually makes her a contemporary of Jane Elliott, who we met at the beginning of the tour. But her travel tale is coming later in her life. So Jane Elliott was traveling in her 20s. We're going to talk about a journey that Mary Spooner took when she was 52. Mary was the 9th child of Captain Nathaniel and Mary Holmes Spooner. She married her second cousin, Ephraim Spooner, in 1830, and the couple had 2 children, James Walter and Esther. Now, many of the letters in the Antiquarian Society's Spooner House collection revealed that Mary traveled somewhat frequently with her brother, who was Born Spooner. And if that name sounds familiar, Born Spooner was the founder of the Plymouth Cordage Company, founded in 1824. He was very successful, so he was able to afford trips to various places, and he often took Mary as a companion to his wife, Hannah Bartlett Spooner. At the time of the journey that I'll be talking about, Mary and Ephraim Spooner were not in such well-to-do circumstances. They were sort of the poor cousins of the Spooner family, and they were actually living on Leyden Street, so right here in downtown Plymouth, in a house that was demolished in the 20th century, but they didn't own the house. They were basically boarding there. In 1856, Mary travels with Born, her brother, Hannah, her sister-in-law, and their sons, Charles and Edward, to Sharon Springs, New York, about 50 miles west of Albany, New York. Now, we believe that the purpose of their voyage, or their journey, was to seek medical treatment for Hannah at the natural mineral pools in Sharon Springs. And these pools were supposed to have medicinal benefits. In 1825, David Eldridge had established a boarding house near the springs. And by 1841, people traveled from all over the country to bathe there. And it wasn't just, for medicinal healing purposes. It really became a spa resort for the social elite. So during the second half of the 19th century, Sharon Springs would often have over 10,000 visitors each summer, staying in over 60 hotels and boarding houses. And transportation improvements drove this growth. In particular, the creation of the canal system in the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, which connected the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie. Now, Sharon Springs was not right on the Erie Canal, but it was only 10 miles to the north, so it would have been easy for visitors to come on the Erie Canal by steamboat, to get off and take a stagecoach up to Sharon Springs to the spa. On September 4th, 1856, Mary writes to Ephraim about their most delightful journey to Sharon Springs. She says, and they actually made their way there via New York City. And so she says, "I was agreeably disappointed in New York. It was a much cleaner, better looking city than I expected, and not a pig to be seen. So I could not make a comparison between yours and the city pigs. We stopped at the Lafarge House, one of the finest houses in the United States, my friends say, and it was certainly the finest I ever stopped at." Now, the Lafarge House was a hotel on Broadway in New York City, a really popular one in this period of the 19th century. From New York City, the Spooners go up the Hudson River. Mary writes, "The sail from there to Albany up the Hudson I cannot begin to describe. It was far more beautiful than anything I ever imagined. There is so much variety in it, and the scenery so constantly changing, sometimes the river quite narrow, then winding round beautifully, and the land sloping gradually to the water, then suddenly rising to mountain height, and here and there a beautiful country seat. Altogether was more picturesque than anything I ever saw in a painting." And interestingly enough, in the 1870s, the Hudson River Valley School, actually Thomas Cole and other painters, are inspired by the Hudson River to paint it. So they agreed with Mary, this is worth painting and trying to document because it's such a beautiful way. So Mary, with the Born Spooners, reaches Sharon Springs via this trip probably by steamboat, up the river. And then on September 22nd, she's on her return journey to Plymouth. So they probably spent, if they arrived, in September 4th, they're on their way home September 22nd. So it's a pretty nice stay there at the spa. September 22nd, Mary writes again to Ephraim from Springfield on the journey home. She says, We left Albany at 9 this morning and arrived about 2 after a delightful ride of 5 hours. Now, Albany to Springfield is about 85 miles. So this is an overland route that took 5 hours, possibly done by stagecoach or possibly by a railroad car. And we'll get to the railroad in a minute. Mary has a number of reflections on what she's seen in Albany and in Springfield. She says, "It is quite an exciting time here, as it seems to be everywhere we have been, and all seem to be confident Fremont will be elected." Now, she's actually speaking about the presidential election, which was to be held on November 4th, 1856, so just a few months in the future for Mary. And it should be noted that Bourne Spooner and many of the other Spooners were abolitionists. And the 1850s, of course, is this very tense period in American history, which eventually leads to the Civil War in the 1860s. But Bourne is an abolitionist. He would have supported the Republican candidate in the 1856 election. But actually the Democrat, who is James Buchanan, won in November of 1856. Mary also mentions that there was a large public meeting, and Anson Burlingame was the speaker there, and she says, "Now and then we hear music and cheering." And he was actually a Republican Party legislator. He was a diplomat and also an abolitionist. And in this speech that he gave, he denounced Democratic Representative Preston Brooks for his vicious attack on Republican Senator Charles Sumner in May of 1856, and gave a very powerful anti-slavery speech. So again, it makes sense given Mary's connection to Bourne Spooner, that they would be excited to hear about all this enthusiasm that there seems to be for the Republican presidential candidate. She finishes, "Yesterday we rode about the city of Albany and saw all the places of interest, and I was surprised to find it so much of a place. However, it will not, in my opinion, compare with New York or Boston." So those are her impressions on this journey from New York to Springfield. And how is she then going to get home from Springfield to Boston? What is it like to, they're obviously, the Spooners are not retracing their previous route and taking the steamboat down the Hudson to go to New York City. And if we think about, we talked about the Erie Canal, which was a wonderful way for people in New York to go west. But you really couldn't create a canal connecting Boston to the Midwest because you have the Berkshires in the way. And so it really, for investors in Boston, it's really important that they don't want to lose out to New York on all this trade. And so what do they invest in? They invest in the railroad. Because you actually could build a railroad over the Berkshires, and if necessary through the Berkshires, and get to New York that way. It's a very expensive, very time-consuming endeavor, and so it does take a long time. The Boston and Worcester Railroad was chartered in 1831, and then the Western Railroad was chartered in 1833 to connect the Boston and Worcester Railroad to the Hudson and Berkshire Railroad at the New York state line. And so, by the time that Mary is traveling, you could actually travel on those multiple lines to get from Boston to New York. In the 1860s and 70s, there are a number of mergers that created one massive company, the Boston and Albany Railroad, and that was actually the first continuous rail line across the Commonwealth. Now, so we don't have a letter that survives that confirms that Mary and Spooners took the railroad back to Boston, but they probably did from Springfield. So when they get to Boston, how then do they get home to Plymouth? Well, here again, we now have a railroad. It was a little bit, about 10 years after Dr. James Thatcher, bemoaned the fact that Plymouth didn't have a railroad in 1835. We have the Old Colony Railroad here in Plymouth, completed in 1845. and this connected Plymouth to South Boston via Abington, just about 45 miles, and that train trip would take you about 2 hours. So it's a little bit better, right? The stagecoach took, what did I say, 10 hours? So now it takes you 2 hours to get to Boston. In 1892, the Plymouth and Middleborough line started service, and so this was the first time that Plymouth was connected to service beyond just going up to Boston and the towns along Boston. So now they're connected to Cape Cod and to Providence. 1892, that's surprisingly quite a number of decades after the Old Colony Railroad was first finished. The railroad is intended for freight. How can we get goods to market? How can we, expand our commercial networks? But they increasingly attract passengers. They're faster, they're more reliable than the stagecoach. And so, people start, riding on the railroad. And there are all sorts of amenities that are created to make railroad travel more comfortable. And if you get to a town where, if you want to reach a town that's inaccessible by railroad, well, the stagecoach is still there. So again, you might get to Boston, and if you want to go to a town that's further out, you could get a stagecoach line right there. Now, if you're interested in reading more of Mary's letters and other Spooner letters, we had an intern last year, Sophie Kuntz, who created an online exhibit. She transcribed them, and they're all available digitally with notes for you. So you can go to the Plymouth Antiquarian Society website to read those letters. But I now want to jump forward from the 1850s and the wonder of train travel to talk about James Spooner, who again is buried here. He has his own stone. He was Mary Spooner's grandson, the son of her son, another James. And there's a scrap of paper that survives in the Antiquarian Society's collection that I just love. And I came across it, and I think it probably for me is more of there's a personal connection, because I'm the type of person who, when I go on a trip, I don't have time to journal, but I want to remember what I did. So I always grab a piece of paper and I'm jotting down notes. Monday, sunny, went to the beach. And in my brain, I think I'll go home and I'll write like a beautiful narrative account that will just like express all the wonderful things I'm seeing and doing. And I never do, but at least I have that paper. And so this is what we have from James Spooner, just this hastily scribbled in pencil account of an 11-day trip in the end of August and the beginning of September of 1913 to Mount Desert Island, Maine. And if you've been there, I'm sure you can have a picture in your mind already. Mount Desert Island, incredible natural beauty, the highest point on the North Atlantic seaboard, just a really wonderful place to visit. In the mid-1800s, it was one of these places like the Hudson River Valley that was really popularized by painters in the Hudson River School. And so tourists see these paintings and they say, well, that looks like a great place to go. So they begin arriving by steamboats and yachts, and it grows into a popular summer resort for the wealthy elite. But as more transportation, as the transportation systems improve, more and more people, they don't have to be excessively wealthy, but they have access to Mount Desert Island. John D. Rockefeller is one of these wealthy elites who loves the place. He buys up a lot of property there. He gives a large parcel of land to the federal government. And President Wilson announced the creation of the Sierra de Mont National Monument in 1916. In 1919, that land and other parcels that had been added to it became the Lafayette National Park. And then in 1929, the name Acadia National Park was adopted. So Mount Desert Island, the large part of Mount Desert Island is made up of Acadia National Park. So let's get back to James Spooner. He is living at 27 North Street in 1913. He's 45 years old. He's unmarried. He works at the Plymouth Cordage Company, which had been founded by his great uncle. And so he decides to go to Maine. And we think probably he took the steamboat. He notes on his scribbled itinerary that he arrived at Southwest Harbor, which is one of the towns on Mount Desert Island, He arrived at the wharf. And so you could actually take the Eastern Steamship Line from Boston to Bangor, Maine, with connections to Mount Desert Island, different towns in Mount Desert Island. And that was a daily service. So it was really easy to get up there. In 1903, a round-trip ticket from Boston to Southwest Harbor was $7.50. We know that James Spooner stayed at Hotel Dirigo, which is the main state motto is Dirigo, I guide or I lead. And he references a number of people who, some of them we don't know who they are. He references someone by the initial W, so we think that might be Walter Spooner, James's brother. He also mentions Maud and Alfred, and that Maud was James's sister and Alfred was her husband. So you get a sense that this is a vacation where a lot of different friends and family members are also kind of popping in for those 11 days. Now, what does James do there? Well, he does a lot of driving and motorboating. He goes by car or motorboat to other sites on the island that are still popular tourist destinations. So Bar Harbor, Jordan Pond, Northeast Harbor, Somesville, Big Cranberry Island. He's documenting going to all these locations. He also documents all the hikes he took. So he climbed Flying Mountain, Western Mountain, Robinson Mountain, which is now called Acadia Mountain, Dog Mountain, Jordan Mountain, Brown Mountain, Sargent Mountain, which is the second highest point in Acadia National Park, and it's an elevation of 1,373 feet. So this is I mean, what a great vacation. James is out there just doing all this walking and hiking and sightseeing. And again, I think it's sort of an interesting comparison to James Thatcher at the beginning of the tour, you know, who was celebrating the stagecoach from saving people from walking. And now we have James Spooner, who goes on a vacation to walk. So, and I do that too. So I'm thankful I don't have to walk everywhere every day, but I'm also thankful that there are beautiful places where I can do a lot of walking. All right, we have one final stop, and it's quite close. We're just going to walk down the asphalt path and stop at the corner before we leave the cemetery. I wanted to include a little bit about local travel, because up to this point we've talked about people going overseas, going to New York, you know, going to Maine. But what about travel within Plymouth, and how do some of these improvements to transportation systems impact local life? And so to do that, I'm here at the grave of Thomas Everett Cornish, who was a Plymouth sea captain and who is my great-great-great-grandfather. So I have a personal connection to the Cornishes. Thomas Everett is buried here with his wife, Zoraida, her sister, Louisa, and then Thomas and Zoraida's daughter, Mary Zoraida Cornish, and you'll notice that there's only room for her name on the front of the stone, and her birth and death years are actually on the back of the stone. Then we also have individual markers for each of those four people, and we think that Thomas and Zoraida's son, also a Thomas Everett, known as Everett, we think he probably erected these memorials. He had a lot of money. He was quite successful, so he could afford them. He also indicates the relationship of each of the person to himself. So Aunt Louisa, Sister Mary, mother, father. You know, you get to do that when you're the last one to survive. You know, you get to bury everybody else. Well, I want to focus on Mary Zoraida Cornish. We know that Thomas and Zoraida had 4 daughters in addition to their son, and 2 of them at least taught in the Plymouth schools. Mary Zoraida, who is buried here, and my great-great-grandmother Annette Cornish, who is buried down in the Manomet Cemetery. A letter survives in my family's collection from the 1860s, which Annette wrote to her sister Mary while she was teaching at the Ellisville School. And at this time, Annette was probably 19, 20, or 21. We're not quite sure of the year of the letter. But she's teaching at Ellisville School, which was located roughly where the entrance to Ellisville State Park is today. And it was what was called an ungraded school, which means that it was what we would call a one-room schoolhouse. So all of the students, all different ages, in one room with one teacher. Now, how does this connect with transportation? I want us to stop for a minute and think about the fact that Plymouth in the 1860s had 25 school buildings. Today we have 14, and today we have 10 times the population as Plymouth did in the 1860s. So although the population in 1860 was only 6,800, families were spread out geographically. Consolidation was not possible because people lived too far. And if you live too far from your school, well, you're not going to go to school. How did students get to school? They walked uphill both ways, right? They walked. I don't know if it was uphill, but you had to be able to walk to school and to be able to be there every day. And actually in the 19th century, the Plymouth school superintendent would frequently write in his reports, well, we're trying to figure out a way to maximize attendance, because they recognize that distance is an obstacle. So how can we get people to come to school? In Manomet, they had a grammar school, which was for the older elementary kids, and then a primary school, which was for the younger elementary kids. So primary would have probably been ages 5 to 9. Grammar would have been maybe ages 10 to 14. But in any case, you had families sending all their kids to whichever school was closest to them. So I said, well, I have a 14-year-old. Well, we'll send him to the primary school because it's not too far. And this causes all sorts of problems for the teachers, as you can imagine. Now, Annette is down in Ellisville. She is boarding there with one of the Ellis families. The Cornishes, her parents, meanwhile, are living on Sandwich Street in Wellingsley, so roughly 11 miles north of Ellisville. And again, for us, 11 miles seems like a very short distance. We're so used to driving it and thinking nothing of it. But Annette's letter is full of just this feeling of homesickness. She says, I want to come home. Homesickness will put me into a consumption, I'm afraid. And how could she get home? Well, again, 11 miles is a long distance for a young woman to walk. She would have to maybe borrow a horse. She'd have to find someone to take her, in a wagon or, so it really was quite remote to be down in Ellisville. And so she writes to her sister Mary, well, what are you doing for the 4th of July in Plymouth? Now, again, she's in Ellisville. Technically, she's still in Plymouth. But to her, Plymouth is, Wellingsley in the center of town. What are you doing for 4th of July up there? She says, I don't suppose there will be anything going on down here. And I have been thinking that if it were practicable, I should like to come home. If the plan is approved of by the elder powers of the family, if Mr. Ellis will let us have the horse, we will come. But if not, then I can stay here. And she even ends her letter, write some of you and let me know whether Plymouth has been destroyed by fire or by the rebels, for I don't know how far they have got. So again, this is during the Civil War, and I guess that emphasizes this feeling of remoteness. She's down in Ellisville. Oh my gosh, she can't even go home for the 4th of July. She does mention that she took a trip to Sandwich, which was about 8 miles south of Ellisville, so it was easier for her to get to Sandwich than to get home to Wellingsley. She says, I went to Sandwich last Saturday afternoon. Mrs. Ellis, Emma Hitty, and I, we don't know who Emma and Hitty were. Probably Mrs. Ellis was the woman in whose house she was boarding. She says, we had a nice time, started about 1:30 and got home at 8. So it was a 7-hour trip. Sandwich is not so large as Plymouth, nor as pleasant. There are a good many Irish there who work in the glass factory. So that though Irish are very good people, some of them, they are not quite so pleasant neighbors. And I should not like to live there. Which, I have Irish roots as well as Cornish roots, so I don't know what my great-great-grandmother would think. But she notes, coming home, we had some oranges and coconut cakes to eat. So it sounds like a very pleasant trip in spite of the Irish. But clearly, Annette would much prefer to be closer to downtown Plymouth. And I'm sure she was relieved. In 1867, there's a record that she was teaching at the Russell Mills School, which is probably about 4 miles from Wellingsley. And she actually marries to Harvey Briggs in 1869, so that ends her teaching career. Her sister Mary, who's buried here, taught at a number of public schools in the 1870s. We know she taught at the Grammar School number 2, which was above the training green on Sandwich Street in downtown Plymouth. And she taught at the Manomet Grammar School as well. And so, again, we've talked about how we have all these schools in Plymouth because of these the obstacle of distance. One thing that happens in Mary's lifetime that makes a huge difference is the creation of the street railway. So Plymouth was actually one of the earliest towns in the country to have an electric trolley system. A lot of other towns had a horse-drawn trolley, but in order to have an electric system, the Plymouth and Kingston Street Railway had to build their own power plant on the waterfront. In 1889, the Plymouth and Kingston Street Railway had almost 4 miles of track with 5 electric cars. In 1900, they absorbed into the Brockton and Plymouth Street Railway, and they have a total of 24 miles from Manomet up to Whitman. And why is this such an important transportation development? Well, children can use it to get to school. You begin to have the consolidation of schools, and you begin to have more of division by grade level. Commuters can use it to get to factory jobs. So in the previous decades, you actually had people leaving small towns and going to the cities where the factories were. Now with the street railway, you have the reverse. People say, wow, I don't have to live where I work. I can move out to a small town. I can move out to the country, and that might even be cheaper for me. And then in the summer, you have vacationers who can use the street railway to get to all sorts of wonderful places. So you can take it to amusement parks like Mayflower Grove and Pembroke, and you can take it to resort destinations like the Hotel Pilgrim, which overlooked Plymouth Beach. You could come to Plymouth via the railroad from Boston, and then you could pick up the trolley and go from the railroad station down to the hotel. It really dramatically changes the type of people, who's coming to Plymouth, who's living in Plymouth, and how people within Plymouth itself really connect to one another and see themselves. In 1922, the Kingston, or the Brockton and Plymouth Street Railway reorganizes itself. It's having some financial difficulties, and it becomes the Plymouth and Brockton Street Railway, a switch of the name. And then in 1928, the Plymouth and Brockton Street Railway became the Plymouth and Brockton. Well, they developed a bus system, as they still exist today, the P&B bus. Now, of course, why did the street railway system turn into bus system? Well, because of the automobile. Cars become very popular in Massachusetts after World War I, and you have that really killing these public transportation systems. Everybody wants to have a card. Thanks to Mr. Ford, you know, they're becoming more affordable to the average person. So now you don't want to be tied down to a railroad timetable. You want to go where you want to go, when you want to go, with you know, whoever you want to go with. And so the automobile allows for this revolution in transportation, and ultimately it has a huge impact on American culture as well. And I just want to finish the tour by pointing out that cars have a dramatic impact on the landscape. So we can turn from our beautiful historic graveyard and look at all the parking spaces that we have along Russell Street. And just to bring it back, you know, to thinking about Mary and Annette and the teachers of Plymouth, we actually used to have 2 schools here on Russell Street. We had a school building right where that parking lot is, that, you know, was built in the 1840s. It was there until the 1960s, and then the Plymouth Police Station was built there. Now the Plymouth Police Station is gone, and we have a parking lot. Across the street, so behind the Powder House down the hill that way, that's another parking lot, but there was a school built there in 1896, which again was used into the 1960s and then demolished and became a parking lot. So if you have cars on the road, you need to have gas stations, you need to have places where people can park them. It really dramatically changes our community. And just one final connection to the Cornishes, since we're here. When the new school on Russell Street was built in 1896, it was felt, well, it might be confusing. Up to this point, Plymouth just called schools by their locations. So the Manamet School, the Russell Street School. And now they're like, well, there's 2 schools on Russell Street, so what are we going to call them? We're going to have to name them after someone. So they named the new school the Burton School, after Charles Burton, who was superintendent of schools in Plymouth for many years. And then the old school that still stood there at that time, they named the Cornish School. And growing up, I think I was always like, oh, it must be some connection to my family. And there is a connection, it's just a more distant one. So Mary and Annette Cornish taught in the Plymouth schools, but the Cornish School was actually named for Aaron Cornish, who was a longtime Plymouth teacher and principal of the grammar school, and he was a 3rd cousin of Mary's. So we have a slight connection to the Cornish School, which is no longer there. But maybe we'll talk more about automobiles on another tour. We're just so much that we could talk about up here on Burial Hill. So before you go, I do want to remind you the recording will be available on May 7th. And then our next tour is June 4th, and that will be Stephen O'Neill, who's Executive Director of the Hanover Historical Society, presenting Burying the Dead in the Early Republic. So that is definitely a tour not to be missed, but if you do, again, Connor will be filming it, so you can always watch the recording. But thank you so much for joining me today. Have a wonderful afternoon.